In the cafeteria of Roosevelt High School, a quiet scholarship student was about to face her worst nightmare. What started as an ordinary lunch break took a shocking turn when she came face to face with the school's most ruthless bullies. Zuri Allen wasn't your typical 16-year-old. For years, she had spent her life learning her grandmother's sewing techniques, known for transforming scraps into stunning handmade garments that told stories of resilience and creativity. When they encountered her wearing the denim coat she'd painstakingly crafted from donated materials, the bullies systematically tore it apart in front of hundreds of students. Zuri had no idea she was walking into a moment that would define her entire future. Her response to channel her devastation into pure creative fire would lead to consequences no one could have predicted. What began as public humiliation would become a viral sensation. The Roosevelt High community would never be the same after witnessing how a destroyed coat became the foundation for a fashion empire, transforming not just one girl's life, but inspiring an entire generation of young creators to find power in their authenticity. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The January wind cut through Detroit like a blade searching for bone, and Zuri Allen pulled her handmade coat tighter as she climbed the concrete steps of Roosevelt High School. The coat was her pride and her shame all at once, crafted from old denim her grandmother had saved, lined with flannel from donated blankets, and stitched together with thread she'd bought with lunch money over 3 months. Every seam told a story of necessity, every patch a testament to making something beautiful from scraps that others had discarded. At 16, Zuri had learned to navigate the treacherous social waters of high school with the same careful precision her grandmother had taught her to use when threading in needle-steady hands, focused eyes, and the understanding that one wrong move could unravel everything. The scholarship that had gotten her into Roosevelt's academic program was both a blessing and a target painted on her back, marking her as different in a school where difference was often met with cruelty. She kept her dark eyes downcast as she moved through the hallway, her backpack also handmade from canvas and leather scraps slung over one shoulder. The morning ritual was always the same: arrive early enough to avoid the worst of the crowds, get to her locker without incident, and slip into first period before anyone had a chance to notice her. But today, as she fumbled with her combination lock, she could feel eyes on her like heat from an open flame. "Oh my God, look at that coat," came a voice sharp enough to cut glass. Sabrina Hawthorne's voice always carried perfectly across any space, trained by years of commanding attention in rooms full of people who either feared or desperately wanted to please her. The 17-year-old daughter of a city councilman and a successful lawyer, Sabrina moved through Roosevelt High like she owned every brick and tile, and in many ways, she did. Her family's donations had funded the new computer lab, and her mother sat on the school board. Zuri's fingers stilled on her lock as Sabrina approached, flanked by her usual companions. Chloe Vance hung slightly back, her designer boots clicking against the linoleum as she tried to match Sabrina's confident stride while clearly wrestling with her own discomfort. Where Sabrina was all sharp edges and calculated cruelty, Chloe was softer around the edges, her participation in these moments always seeming reluctant, as if she were following a script she hadn't written but didn't know how to escape. "Is that supposed to be fashion?" Sabrina continued, her voice pitched just loud enough to draw stares from other students, but not quite loud enough to catch a teacher's attention. She had perfected this particular volume over years of practice, because it looks like something from a homeless shelter donation bin. The words hit Zuri like a physical blow, but she forced herself to remain steady. She'd learned long ago that reaction was exactly what bullies fed on: the flinch, the tears, the desperate attempts to defend yourself that only provided more ammunition. Instead, she continued working on her combination, though her hands trembled slightly as she turned the dial. Actually, I think it's kind of interesting, Chloe said quietly, and Zuri caught the flash of surprise that crossed Sabrina's perfectly made-up face. I mean, the stitching is really interesting? Sabrina's laugh was like breaking glass. Chloe, take a picture. I want to remember this look. She pulled out her phone with the casual entitlement of someone who had never been told no. This is what happens when people try to dress above their station. It's actually kind of sad. The camera flash made Zuri blink, and for a moment, the hallway seemed to blur around the edges. She wanted to sink into the floor, to disappear entirely. But instead she finally got her locker open and began gathering her books with movements that were deliberately calm and controlled. You know, Sabrina said, stepping closer so that her expensive perfume mixed unpleasantly with the industrial cleaning smell that always hung in the school corridors. Roosevelt has a dress code. I'm pretty sure that coat violates it. Maybe I should mention it to Principal Harrington. Now Zuri did look up, meeting Sabrina's cold blue eyes directly for the first time. There was something calculating there, a predatory intelligence that reminded Zuri of the documentaries she'd watched. About sharks beautiful and terrible and utterly without mercy. There's nothing wrong with my coat, Zuri said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper, but steady. Oh, she speaks, Sabrina said with mock delight. I was starting to think you were mute. Listen, scholarship girl, let me explain how things work here. There are people who belong and people who don't. There are people who understand their place and people who need to be reminded of it. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to something that wouldn't carry beyond their small circle. Pretending to belong when you clearly don't. That's just embarrassing for everyone involved. The warning hung in the air between them like smoke from a fire that hadn't quite been extinguished. Zuri clutched her books tighter and nodded once, not trusting herself to speak again. Sabrina's smile was sharp as a razor's edge as she turned away, Chloe trailing behind her with one last glance back that might have been apologetic as they disappeared into the crowd of students. Zuri, finally, allowed herself to breathe again. Her hands were shaking now, and she pressed them flat against her locker door until the trembling stopped. Around her, the normal chaos of a high school morning continued, locker doors slamming, friends calling to each other, the distant sound of the first bell warning students to get to class. But underneath it all, Zuri could feel the weight of what had just happened settling over her like a storm cloud. This wasn't over. Sabrina Hawthorne didn't make idle threats, and the look in her eyes had promised that this was just the beginning. That evening, Zuri sat at the small kitchen table in the apartment she shared with her mother and 12-year-old brother Terrence, her sketchbook open in front of her. The pages were filled with designs that lived only in her imagination, flowing dresses that could be made from curtain fabric, structured jackets built from old blazers found at thrift stores, accessories crafted from materials that most people would throw away without a second thought. You're doing that thing again, Terrence said, looking up from his homework. Despite being 4 years younger, he had an old soul and eyes that saw too much. The thing where you draw really fast when you're upset about something. Zuri's pencil stilled on the page. I'm not upset. Right, he said with the kind of knowing skepticism that only little brothers could master. That's why you've been stabbing that paper with your pencil for the last 10 minutes. What happened at school? She looked at her brother, really looked at him. His school clothes were as carefully maintained as hers, patched and mended, but clean and pressed. Their mother worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat, and both children had learned early that every dollar mattered. Every piece of clothing had to last as long as possible. Some girls were just being stupid, she said finally. Rich girls? Yeah, rich girls. Terrence nodded sagely. Mom says rich people sometimes don't know how to act around regular people because they've never had to learn. She says it makes them scared. Scared? Zuri looked at her brother with surprise. Think about it, Terrence said, warming to his theme. They've never had to be creative like you. They've never had to make something beautiful out of nothing. That's like a superpower, Zuri. And superpowers always make regular people nervous. Despite everything, Zuri found herself smiling. You think I have superpowers? I know you do, Terrence said with absolute certainty. I've seen what you can do with a sewing machine and some fabric scraps. That's magic, sister. And tomorrow you should show them exactly what kind of magic you're working with. As Zuri looked down at her sketchbook, her pencil began moving again. But this time with purpose rather than nervous energy. She began sketching something new, not just a design, but a statement. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready or not, and Sabrina Hawthorne thought she knew exactly who she was dealing with. She was about to learn otherwise. The next morning dawned gray and bitter, with the kind of cold that seemed to seep through walls and windows to settle in your bones. Zuri dressed carefully in her uniform, a white blouse she'd tailored to fit perfectly, a navy skirt she'd hemmed by hand, and the same handmade coat that had drawn Sabrina's attention the day before. As she walked through Roosevelt's doors, she told herself that yesterday had been an isolated incident, that maybe Sabrina had already moved on to easier targets. She should have known better. The attack came during lunch, swift and calculated and devastating in its precision. Zuri had been sitting alone at a corner table in the cafeteria, her sketchbook open beside her tray as she worked on a new design while eating. The background noise of hundreds of conversations had faded to white noise, and she was lost in the flow of creation when shadows fell across her table. Still playing dress up, I see. Sabrina's voice cut through her concentration like a blade through silk. Zuri looked up to find herself surrounded. Sabrina stood directly in front of her, with Chloe to her left and Madison Torres, a junior who followed Sabrina's lead with the desperate intensity of someone afraid of being cast out to her right. They had positioned themselves strategically, blocking her exit and creating a pocket of space that felt suddenly airless. That's a cute little book, Sabrina continued, reaching out to flip through the pages before Zuri could stop her. Are these supposed to be fashion designs? They look like something a kindergartner would draw. Don't touch that, Zuri said, but her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She reached for the sketchbook, but Sabrina held it just out of reach, turning it so that Madison could see the pages. Oh my God, look at this one, Madison laughed, pointing at a sketch of an evening gown constructed from layered scarves. She actually thinks she's a designer. That's adorable. Please give it back, Zuri said, standing up now, her heart beginning to pound against her ribs like a caged bird. Around them, other students were starting to notice the commotion, conversations, faltering as heads turned to watch the drama unfold. You know what your problem is? Sabrina said, still holding the sketchbook just out of reach. You don't know your place. You come to our school, wearing your little homemade costumes, acting like you belong here. But you don't belong here. Scholarship girl. And maybe it's time someone reminded you of that. What happened next unfolded with the horrible slow-motion clarity of a car accident. Sabrina's milk carton, seemingly by accident, but with the kind of calculated aim that spoke of practice, tipped over, sending a river of chocolate milk across the table and directly onto Zuri's open sketchbook. The pages, filled with months of careful work and dreaming, began to curl and stain as the liquid soaked through. Oops, Sabrina said with mock concern. How clumsy of me. Zuri lunged forward to save what she could, but Madison's hand shot out to grab her arm, fingers digging in with surprising strength. Where are you going? We're not done talking. Let go of me, Zuri said, her voice rising for the first time. But Madison's grip only tightened. You need to learn some manners, Sabrina said, and now her voice had dropped to something cold and dangerous. Starting with how to dress appropriately for school. Zuri felt rather than saw Chloe move behind her, and then there was a sharp tugging sensation as hands grabbed at her coat. The sound of fabric tearing filled the air like a scream, and suddenly the coat, her grandmother's denim, her carefully saved patches, her meticulously hand-sewn seams was coming apart in their hands. "Stop!" Zuri cried out, trying to twist away, but there were too many hands and they moved with too much coordination. More fabric tore, buttons scattered across the linoleum floor, and the lining that had taken her weeks to attach properly was ripped away in ragged strips. The cafeteria had gone completely silent now, hundreds of students watching in stunned fascination as Zuri's coat was systematically destroyed. She could see teachers beginning to move in their direction, but it was happening too fast, and by the time anyone could intervene, the damage would already be done. When they finally released her, Zuri staggered backward, looking down at the ruins of her coat in shock. The sleeves hung in tatters, the back panel was split completely in half, and the careful embroidery she'd added to the collar lay in broken threads across the floor. "Much better," Sabrina said with satisfaction. "Now you look more like you belong." Zuri stood there for a long moment, surrounded by the debris of her work, acutely aware of every eye in the cafeteria fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their stares, some shocked, some amused, some pitying. Her sketchbook lay ruined on the table, pages curling and stained beyond saving. Her coat, the coat she'd spent months creating, hung from her shoulders in ruins. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. The rest of the day passed in a blur of humiliation. She couldn't bring herself to go to her afternoon classes, couldn't bear the thought of sitting in rooms full of people who had witnessed her destruction. Instead, she found herself in the art room, where Mr. Fenwick was grading papers during his free period. "Rough day?" he asked without looking up, his voice carrying the kind of casual understanding that suggested he'd already heard about what had happened. Zuri nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She sank into one of the student chairs, still wearing the ruins of her coat because she had nothing else to put on. "You know," Mr. Fenwick said, finally looking up from his papers, "I've been teaching here for 12 years, and I've learned something important about bullies. They only attack what they're afraid of. What could they possibly be afraid of from me?" Zuri asked, her voice raw with held-back tears. Mr. Fenwick stood up and walked to a supply cabinet, pulling out a large bag filled with fabric scraps, donations from local businesses and community members who supported the art program. "Talent," he said simply. "Authenticity. The kind of creativity that can't be bought or inherited or faked." He set the bag down on the table in front of her. "I saw your work in your sketchbook before it got ruined. You have something special, Zuri, something they could never have, no matter how much money their parents spend." Zuri looked at the fabric scraps, pieces of silk and cotton and wool in every color imaginable, remnants from projects and samples from stores, raw materials waiting to be transformed into something beautiful. "What am I supposed to do with this?" she asked. "Whatever you want," Mr. Fenwick said. "But if I were you, I'd show them exactly what they just tried to destroy. I'd make them understand that creativity isn't something you can tear apart with your bare hands. It just comes back stronger." That evening, Zuri spread the fabric scraps across her bedroom floor like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. Her ruined coat lay beside them, its destruction now looking less like an ending and more like raw material for a new beginning. Terrence sat cross-legged beside her, sorting pieces by color, while she examined each fragment with the intensity of an archaeologist studying ancient treasures. "What are you going to make?" he asked. "I don't know yet," Zuri said, running her fingers over a piece of midnight blue silk that seemed to shimmer even in the dim light of her bedroom. "But it's going to be something they'll never forget." She picked up the largest intact piece from her ruined coat, the front panel that had somehow survived mostly undamaged, and held it up to the light. The denim was soft from years of wear, faded to the perfect shade of blue that only time and love could create. It would be the foundation of whatever came next. "It's going to be armor," she said suddenly, the words surprising her even as she spoke them. "Armor? Something beautiful and strong and impossible to tear apart." Something that shows them exactly who they're dealing with. Terrence grinned, understanding immediately. Like superhero armor? Exactly like superhero armor, Zuri said, and for the first time since the cafeteria incident, she found herself smiling. Tomorrow is going to be very interesting. The transformation began at midnight. Zuri had spent the evening hours planning and sketching, her new design taking shape on paper with the kind of fierce clarity that only came from having something to prove. The dress, because it would be a dress, not just repaired clothing, would be a declaration of war fought with thread and fabric instead of words and fists. She started with the ruins of her grandmother's coat, carefully cutting away the damaged sections and preserving what could be saved. The front panel became the bodice, its faded denim telling the story of generations who had made do with what they had. From Mr. Fenwick's bag of scraps, she selected pieces that spoke to her: midnight blue silk for the skirt's base layer, silver mesh that caught the light like armor plating, burgundy velvet for accents that would draw the eye and demand attention. "You sure you don't want to sleep?" Terrence asked from the doorway, rubbing his eyes. It was nearly 2 in the morning, and Zuri had been working steadily since dinner, her grandmother's old sewing machine humming like a contented cat. "Can't sleep," Zuri said without looking up from the seam she was reinforcing. "Besides, this needs to be perfect." "What are you going to call it?" Terrence asked, settling down beside her workspace to watch her work. Even half asleep, he understood the importance of what was happening here. Zuri paused, considering. The dress was taking shape before her eyes, transforming from separate pieces into something cohesive and powerful. The denim bodice fit like a second skin, structured and strong. The silk skirt flowed like water when she moved, while the mesh overlay caught and reflected light in ways that made the whole thing seem to shimmer and shift. "Reclamation," she said finally. "I'm reclaiming what they tried to take from me." By 4 in the morning, the basic construction was complete. By 6, she had added the details that would make it truly special: hand-sewn beading along the bodice that caught the light like stars, carefully placed patches of velvet that looked intentional rather than makeshift, and a subtle asymmetrical hem that gave the whole thing a sense of movement and purpose. When her alarm went off at 7, Zuri was putting the finishing touches on the garment that would change everything. She held it up in the early morning light filtering through her bedroom window, and even exhausted and running on adrenaline and stubborn determination, she could see that she had created something extraordinary. "Holy shit," Terrence breathed, then immediately looked guilty for swearing. "Holy shit is right," Zuri agreed, too tired and too amazed by her own work to care about language. The dress was unlike anything that had ever walked the halls of Roosevelt High School. It was punk and elegant at the same time, rebellious and refined, a garment that spoke of someone who understood exactly who she was and refused to apologize for it. The denim told a story of heritage and resilience, while the silk whispered of dreams and aspirations. Together, they created something that was unmistakably Zuri, complex, beautiful, and absolutely impossible to ignore. "They're going to lose their minds," Terrence said with the kind of vicious satisfaction that only little brothers could manage. "That's the idea," Zuri said. She felt different as she looked at the dress, stronger, more confident, like she had somehow sewn a piece of her grandmother's fearless spirit directly into the fabric. Tomorrow, when she walked into Roosevelt High wearing reclamation, she wouldn't be the same quiet scholarship student who had been humiliated in the cafeteria. She would be someone new, someone who understood her own power. The next morning, as Zuri stood in front of her bedroom mirror wearing the dress that had cost her a night's sleep and years of accumulated pain, she barely recognized herself. The girl looking back at her stood taller, held her head higher, and wore an expression of quiet determination that would have made her grandmother proud. "You ready for this?" Terrence asked from behind her. Zuri turned away from the mirror and picked up her bag. a new creation she'd thrown together from leftover scraps, structured and purposeful, and perfectly coordinated with her dress. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it yet." As she walked toward Roosevelt High School that morning, the January cold seemed less bitter, the gray sky less oppressive. Students turned to stare as she passed, but this time their attention felt different, less predatory, more surprised. She could hear whispers following in her wake, but instead of cruel laughter, there was something that might have been admiration. By the time she reached the front steps of the school, Zuri Allen had completed her transformation. The quiet, scared girl who had been humiliated in the cafeteria was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the most powerful revenge wasn't violence or cruelty, but the simple act of refusing to be diminished. She pushed open the doors to Roosevelt High and stepped inside, ready to show them exactly what they had unleashed. The moment Zuri Allen stepped through the front doors of Roosevelt High School wearing reclamation, the entire ecosystem of the building shifted on its axis. Conversations died mid-sentence, as heads turned to track her movement down the main hallway, and the usual morning chaos of slamming lockers and shouted greetings gave way to something that felt almost reverent. The dress moved with her like liquid starlight, the midnight blue silk catching the fluorescent lights while the carefully placed denim panels told their story of transformation and survival. Every step she took was deliberate, purposeful, as if she were walking down a runway instead of navigating the scuffed linoleum floors of an underfunded Detroit high school. "Oh my God," someone whispered from behind her, and Zuri felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. She had spent so many mornings trying to become invisible, shrinking into herself and hoping to pass unnoticed through these same hallways. Now, as every eye in the corridor fixed on her with something that looked suspiciously like awe, she understood that invisibility had never been her goal, it had been her prison. Near her locker, she spotted Talia Rojas leaning against the wall with her ever-present camera, the same battered DSLR she used for the school newspaper and her personal blog about social justice issues at Roosevelt. Talia's dark eyes went wide as she took in the full impact of Zuri's transformation, and without hesitation, she raised her camera and began shooting, the rapid-fire clicks of the shutter providing a staccato rhythm to Zuri's approach. "Jesus! Zuri," Talia breathed as her friend reached the locker. "What is this? Where did this come from? You look like you stepped out of a magazine." "I made it," Zuri said simply, and the words carried a weight that hadn't been there before. Not just the fact of creation, but the pride of ownership, the fierce satisfaction of having turned destruction into something beautiful. "You made this? This entire dress?" Talia's voice rose in disbelief, and several students nearby turned to listen. "From what? How?" "From the coat they destroyed," Zuri said, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet that had fallen over their section of the hallway. "From scraps and donations and everything they thought was worthless." The whispers started then, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, and Zuri could feel the story beginning to take on a life of its own. She saw recognition dawning in faces around her students, who had witnessed yesterday's humiliation were now seeing its aftermath, and the narrative was writing itself in real time across their expressions. Down the hallway, she caught sight of Sabrina Hawthorne standing frozen near the trophy case, her usual composed mask slipping to reveal something that might have been shock or fear, or a combination of both. The Queen of Roosevelt High was watching her kingdom shift beneath her feet, and for the first time in Zuri's memory, Sabrina looked uncertain, as if the rules of engagement had suddenly changed and no one had bothered to give her the new playbook. Beside Sabrina, Chloe Vance was staring at Zuri with an expression that was impossible to read, part admiration, part guilt, part something that looked suspiciously like longing. The girl who had helped destroy Zuri's coat was now seeing what had risen from its ashes, and the cognitive dissonance was written clearly across her features. "Can I interview you?" Talia asked suddenly, her journalist instincts kicking into overdrive. For the blog? This is incredible, Zuri. This is a story that needs to be told. Before Zuri could answer, Mr. Fenwick appeared beside them, moving with the kind of casual purposefulness that suggested he had been waiting for exactly this moment. Miss Allen, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Said with a slight smile, that is remarkable work. The construction, the design sensibility, the way you've used color and texture, it's genuinely impressive. Thank you, Zuri said, and she could hear the strength in her own voice, the confidence that came from creating something that even the adults were forced to acknowledge. Have you ever considered entering any design competitions? Mr. Fenwick asked casually, though there was something in his tone that suggested the question wasn't as spontaneous as it appeared. There are programs for young designers, scholarships, mentorship opportunities. I didn't know about anything like that, Zuri admitted. Well, Mr. Fenwick said with the kind of smile that suggested wheels were already turning behind his eyes. Perhaps we should change that. By lunchtime, Talia's photographs had found their way onto her blog with a post titled, "From Destruction to Creation, a Roosevelt Student's Response to Bullying." And from there, the story began to spread with the viral velocity that only the internet could provide. The images showed Zuri in her dress from multiple angles, each one capturing a different aspect of the garment's complexity and beauty. And the accompanying text told the story of yesterday's destruction and today's rebirth with the kind of clear-eyed journalism that Talia was becoming known for. The first share came from a senior at a neighboring school who had followed Talia's blog for her coverage of local education issues. Then a local fashion blogger picked it up, drawn by the uniqueness of the story and the undeniable artistry of the dress. By the time Zuri was walking to her afternoon classes, her phone, a hand-me-down smartphone that usually stayed silent, except for text from family, was buzzing with notifications from social media platforms she barely used. "You're trending," Talia said breathlessly, catching up with her between periods. "Like, actually trending. People are calling you the Detroit DIY queen and asking where they can buy your designs." Zuri stopped walking, the weight of those words settling over her like a blanket. Trending? The post has been shared over 1,000 times in the last 3 hours, Talia continued, her excitement barely contained. There are fashion bloggers from New York commenting on it. Someone from Teen Vogue liked it. "This is insane, Zuri. You're famous." As they spoke, Zuri became aware of other students gathering around them, not with the predatory curiosity that had marked yesterday's attention, but with something that looked suspiciously like respect. These were students she had never spoken to before, kids from different social circles and academic tracks, all drawn together by the story that was unfolding in real time across their phone screens. "Is it true you made that dress from your old coat?" asked a sophomore Zuri recognized from her chemistry class. "Could you make something like that for prom?" wondered a junior with carefully styled hair and makeup that suggested she usually ran in more expensive circles. "How did you learn to sew like that?" came from a boy with paint-stained fingers who Zuri had seen in the art room, but never actually talked to Dot. As Zuri answered their questions, she felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the tight knot of fear and shame that had been her constant companion for so long. These students weren't looking at her with pity or amusement or the cruel calculation she had grown accustomed to seeing in certain faces. They were looking at her with something she had never experienced before, genuine interest in who she was and what she could do. Across the hallway, Sabrina Hawthorne watched the growing crowd around Zuri with an expression that had hardened into something cold and calculating. The girl who had ruled Roosevelt High through fear and social manipulation was seeing her authority challenged not by aggression or rebellion, but by something far more dangerous: genuine talent that couldn't be purchased or inherited or stolen. And, for the first time in her carefully orchestrated high school career, Sabrina Hawthorne looked like she wasn't sure what her next move should be. By Thursday morning, Zuri Allen's world had exploded beyond the confines of Roosevelt High School and spilled out into corners of the internet she had never known existed. The tipping point had come sometime Wednesday evening when a fashion influencer with 500,000 followers stumbled across Talia's blog post and shared it with the caption, "This is what real creativity looks like. 16-year-old designer turns bullying into art." From there, the story had been picked up by fashion micro-communities, DIY crafting groups, and social justice advocates who saw in Zuri's transformation something larger than just one girl's response to cruelty. Her phone had become unusable, the notifications coming so fast and constant that she had finally turned it off and hidden it in her dresser drawer just to get some peace. But even without the constant buzzing, she could feel the attention like heat from a distant fire, warming and terrifying in equal measure. "There's a reporter from the Detroit Free Press asking to interview you," her mother said over breakfast, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment that Zuri had been seeing in a lot of faces lately. "And someone from something called Refinery 29 wants to feature you in an article about teen fashion entrepreneurs." Zuri stared at her scrambled eggs, trying to process the surreal turn her life had taken. 3 days ago, she had been invisible, just another scholarship student trying to survive high school without incident. Now apparently, people across the country were talking about her, sharing her story, and asking questions about her future that she had never dared to ask herself. "I don't know what to say to reporters," she admitted. "You don't have to say anything you don't want to," her mother replied gently. "But Zuri, baby, what you did, what you made, it's special. People can see that." At school, the attention had crystallized into something that felt both wonderful and overwhelming. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before were going out of their way to speak to her, and several teachers had made comments about her artistic achievement that suggested the story had spread through the faculty as well. Even Principal Harrington had nodded approvingly when she passed him in the hallway, a man who usually seemed to look right through students like her. But it was the message waiting in her Instagram DMs that really changed everything. "Hi Zuri." The message read, from an account belonging to someone named Elena Vasquez, whose bio identified her as a fashion director and teen mentor. "I saw your incredible work on social media and wanted to reach out. I'm involved with the National Young Designers Program, a scholarship and mentorship initiative for emerging teen talent. Would you be interested in learning more? Your work shows exactly the kind of innovative thinking and resourcefulness we're looking for." Zuri read the message 3 times before she was sure it was real, then screenshot it and ran to find Talia, who was in the computer lab working on another article about the way Zuri's story was resonating with students across the district. "This is huge," Talia said after reading the screenshot. "The National Young Designers Program? I've heard of that. They only take like 20 students nationwide each year, and it's a full scholarship to study with actual fashion designers in New York. But I didn't apply for anything," Zuri said, confusion mixing with excitement in her chest. "Someone must have nominated you," Talia said, her investigative journalist brain immediately jumping to the logical conclusion. "Someone who saw your work and thought you deserved recognition." They found their answer during lunch when Mr. Fenwick approached their table with a smile that managed to be both sheepish and proud. "I may have taken some liberties," he said without preamble. "After seeing your dress on Monday, I submitted some photos and a description of your work to a program I've been following for years. I hope you don't mind. You nominated me for the National Young Designers Program?" Zuri asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did," Mr. Fenwick said simply. "You have talent, Zuri, real talent. The kind that deserves to be nurtured and developed, not hidden away because of circumstances beyond your control." Before Zuri could respond, she became aware of a commotion near the entrance to the cafeteria. Raised voices were carrying across the space, and when she turned to look, she saw Chloe Vance standing near the serving line, facing off against Sabrina Hawthorne in what appeared to be their first public disagreement in years. "This has gone too far," Chloe was saying, her voice carrying a strength that Zuri had never heard from her before. "What we did was wrong, Sabrina. We destroyed something beautiful, and now everyone can see what it became. We look like monsters. We look like people who know their place," Sabrina snapped back. But there was something desperate in her tone, as if she was trying to convince herself as much as Chloe. "She's getting attention that should belong to people who actually matter." "People who actually matter?" Chloe's voice rose in disbelief. "Listen to yourself. You sound insane." The argument was drawing stares from across the cafeteria, students turning away from their conversations to watch the drama unfold. For someone like Sabrina, who had built her reputation on maintaining perfect control over her image and her followers, having this kind of public disagreement was tantamount to social suicide. "Don't you dare lecture me about what matters," Sabrina hissed, stepping closer to Chloe in a way that felt threatening. "I made you. I can unmake you just as easily. Maybe I don't want to be made by someone like you anymore," Chloe shot back. And the words seemed to surprise her as much as they surprised everyone else listening. The confrontation ended with Chloe walking away, leaving Sabrina standing alone near the serving line with an expression of barely controlled fury. As she surveyed the cafeteria, her eyes found Zuri's table, and for a moment, the two girls looked directly at each other across the space. What Zuri saw in Sabrina's face wasn't just anger or frustration, it was fear. The kind of primal terror that came from watching your entire world shift beneath your feet and realizing that all the weapons you had relied on for protection were suddenly useless. Later that afternoon, as Zuri was gathering her things from her locker, she felt a gentle touch on her shoulder and turned to find Chloe standing behind her, looking nervous but determined. "I wanted to apologize," Chloe said without preamble, "for what we did to your coat, for everything. It was wrong. And I was wrong to go along with it." Zuri studied the other girl's face, looking for signs of deception or calculation, but finding only genuine remorse and something that might have been admiration. "Why now?" Zuri asked. "Because I saw what you made from what we destroyed," Chloe said simply. "And I realized that I've never created anything beautiful in my entire life. I've just followed other people around and pretended that made me important." "It's not too late to start," Zuri said quietly. Chloe smiled, and for the first time since Zuri had known her, it looked completely genuine. "Maybe you could teach me sometime how to make something instead of just destroying things." As Zuri walked home that afternoon, her mind was spinning with possibilities that hadn't existed a week earlier. The National Young Designers Program, potential mentorship opportunities, scholarship possibilities, and the growing sense that her story was resonating with people far beyond the walls of Roosevelt High School. But underlying all of it was a deeper understanding of something her grandmother had tried to teach her years earlier. That creativity wasn't just about making beautiful things. It was about taking whatever life handed you and transforming it into something that reflected who you were meant to become. And Zuri Allen was just getting started. The pressure hit Zuri like a physical weight the moment she woke up Friday morning, settling on her chest and making it difficult to breathe normally. Elena Vasquez had responded to her tentative reply with a phone call that lasted nearly an hour, explaining the National Young Designers Program with the kind of enthusiasm that made it clear this wasn't just a polite inquiry, but a genuine opportunity that could change the trajectory of Zuri's entire life. The catch, because there was always a catch, was that she needed to submit a portfolio of 3 original designs within 2 weeks. Pieces that would demonstrate not just her technical skill, but her unique voice as a designer. It's not just about pretty clothes. Elena had explained during their conversation. We're looking for designers who understand that fashion can be a form of communication, storytelling, even activism. Your reclamation dress showed us all three of those elements. Now, sitting at her kitchen table with her sketchbook open and her mind completely blank, Zuri was beginning to understand what people meant when they talked about imposter syndrome. Every design she tried to draw looked amateurish compared to the polished work she'd seen from previous program participants when she'd researched them online. Every idea felt derivative, uninspired, not nearly good enough for something as prestigious as the National Young Designers Program. "You're doing that thing again," Terrence observed from across the table, where he was supposedly working on math homework, but was clearly more interested in watching his sister have what appeared to be a creative breakdown. "What thing?" "The thing where you draw something, scowl at it, tear out the page, and start over. You've been doing it for like an hour." Zuri looked down at the crumpled papers scattered around her chair and realized he was right. Nothing was coming together the way it should, and the harder she tried to force inspiration, the more elusive it became. "I don't know what I'm doing," she admitted. "These people are expecting something amazing, and I'm just a kid from Detroit who learned to sew from her grandmother." "Yeah," Terrence said matter-of-factly. "A kid from Detroit who turned a destroyed coat into something so incredible that people in New York are calling you. Maybe stop trying to be someone else and just be who you are." Before Zuri could respond, there was a soft knock at their apartment door. When she opened it, she found Chloe Vance standing in the hallway, looking nervous and holding a large shopping bag that seemed almost too heavy for her to carry. "I hope this is okay," Chloe said quickly, as if she had rehearsed the words but was afraid she might lose her nerve before getting them out. "I know showing up at your place is probably weird, but I wanted to help and I wasn't sure how else." To do it, she held out the shopping bag, which Zuri took with confusion. Inside were bolts of fabric unlike anything she had ever seen, silk that seemed to shift colors in the light, wool so soft it felt like touching a cloud, cotton with a texture so fine it was almost ethereal. "This is from my mother's boutique," Chloe explained, the words tumbling out quickly. She was doing inventory and had all these samples and remnants that she was just going to throw away or donate. "When I told her about what you're doing, not everything, just that you're applying for a design program, she said I should bring them to you." Zuri pulled out a piece of charcoal gray wool that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and immediately she could see it transform, structured, architectural, a garment that would make the wearer feel powerful and protected. Then a length of cream silk that whispered of elegance and movement, and finally a bolt of deep emerald cotton that seemed to glow with inner fire. "Chloe, this is," Zuri began, but found herself unable to finish the sentence. "It's an apology," Chloe said quietly, "a real one. I can't undo what I did, but maybe I can help you do something amazing instead." That night, with Terrence asleep in the next room and the apartment quiet except for the hum of her grandmother's sewing machine, Zuri began to create the portfolio that would define her future. The first piece, built around the charcoal gray wool Chloe had brought her, became Second Skin, a structured jacket with clean lines and hidden details that revealed themselves only upon close inspection. It was armor disguised as elegance, protection that didn't sacrifice beauty. The second design, emerging from the cream silk like a whisper becoming a shout, became Unseen Threads, a dress that appeared simple from a distance but revealed layers of complexity as you looked closer. Hand-sewn details that caught the light, asymmetrical seams that created movement and interest. A garment that spoke to the idea that the most powerful things were often the ones that revealed themselves slowly. The third and final piece, crafted from the emerald cotton with accents from her growing collection of scraps and remnants, became Armor Light, an ensemble that combined the structured elements of traditional armor with the fluidity of dancers' clothing. It was strong and soft at the same time, protective and vulnerable, a perfect representation of the complex strength that came from surviving difficult circumstances without losing your humanity. As she worked, Zuri felt the familiar flow state that came when her hands knew exactly what they were doing, even when her mind was still catching up. This was what she had been born to do, not just sew, but translate emotions and experiences into fabric and thread, to create garments that told stories about resilience and transformation and the power that came from refusing to be broken. But even as she worked, she was dimly aware of other forces moving around her. Sabrina Hawthorne had not taken her social displacement quietly, and rumors were beginning to circulate that suggested she was planning something that would attempt to undermine Zuri's newfound recognition. There were whispers about plagiarism, accusations, suggestions that Zuri's designs weren't original but stolen from established designers, hints that her entire story was somehow fabricated for attention. "She's getting desperate," Talia warned during one of their late-night phone conversations while Zuri took a break from sewing. "Desperate people do desperate things. You need to be careful." "What can she really do?" Zuri asked, though even as she said it, she could feel a knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "I don't know," Talia admitted. "But she's not going to just disappear quietly. She's lost too much face, and people like Sabrina don't handle that well." As Zuri returned to her sewing, she tried to push those concerns out of her mind and focus on the work in front of her. In 10 days, she would need to photograph and submit her portfolio to the National Young Designers Program. In 10 days, she would find out whether her dreams of a different future were realistic or just fantasies built on temporary viral fame. But tonight, with her grandmother's sewing machine humming and fabric transforming beneath her hands, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. The revolution would be stitched by hand, one careful seam at a time. The preview showcase was scheduled for Thursday afternoon in Roosevelt High's multipurpose room, hastily organized by Principal Harrington after Elena Vasquez had called personally to express the National Young Designers Program's interest in seeing Zuri's work in action. What had started as a simple portfolio submission had evolved into something much larger, a chance for Zuri to present her 3 pieces to a small audience of faculty, students, and local media who had gotten wind of the story. Zuri spent Wednesday night making final adjustments to her pieces, her hands steady despite the butterflies that had taken up permanent residence in her stomach. Each garment hung on improvised dress forms in her bedroom, and every time she looked at them, she felt a mixture of pride and terror that threatened to overwhelm her completely. "You know what the best part is?" Terrence said from his position, cross-legged on her bed, where he had appointed himself Chief Moral Support Officer. "Tomorrow, everyone's going to see what I've known all along, that my sister is basically a superhero, but instead of fighting crime, she fights ugliness." "That's the weirdest compliment anyone's ever given me," Zuri said, but she was smiling as she made one final adjustment to the emerald armor light ensemble. "Weird but true," Terrence insisted. "Besides, after tomorrow, Sabrina Hawthorne is going to have to find a new hobby, because the Let's Make Zuri Allen Miserable business is about to be permanently out of stock." Zuri hoped he was right, but something about Sabrina's silence over the past few days felt ominous rather than reassuring. Girls like Sabrina didn't simply accept defeat and fade quietly into the background. They regrouped. They strategized, and they struck back when their opponents least expected it. The warning came from an unexpected source. Thursday morning, as Zuri was carefully transporting her garments to school in protective garment bags that Chloe had insisted on providing, she found Madison Torres waiting by her locker, the girl who had once been one of Sabrina's most devoted followers now looked nervous and guilty, shifting her weight from foot to foot as if she was preparing to run. "I need to tell you something," Madison said without preamble, glancing around to make sure they weren't being overheard. About what? Sabrina's planning for your presentation. Zuri felt her blood turn to ice water in her veins. What about my presentation? She's been working on something for weeks, Madison said quickly, the words tumbling out as if she was afraid she might lose her nerve. Some kind of plan to prove that your designs aren't original, that you copied them from real designers. She's been researching fashion blogs and websites, looking for anything that looks similar to your work. But I didn't copy anything, Zuri said, confusion mixing with growing panic. These are all my original designs. I know that, Madison said desperately. And you know that, and anyone with eyes knows that. But Sabrina's convinced herself that if she can just discredit you publicly, everything will go back to the way it was before. She's planning to disrupt your presentation with some kind of accusation. Before Zuri could respond, she spotted Sabrina herself approaching from down the hallway, flanked by two girls Zuri didn't recognize, probably friends from other schools, recruited specifically for whatever chaos Sabrina was planning to unleash. Thanks for warning me, Zuri said quietly to Madison, who immediately melted back into the crowd of students as if she had never been there at all. The presentation was scheduled for 7th period, which meant Zuri spent the entire day carrying her carefully protected garments from class to class, unable to leave them unattended even for a moment. By lunchtime, her nerves were stretched to the breaking point, and she was seriously considering canceling the entire thing and submitting her portfolio through traditional channels instead. Absolutely not, Talia said firmly when Zuri voiced this possibility. You are not going to let Sabrina Hawthorne scare you away from your moment. Besides, she added with a sly smile, I've been preparing for this too. Preparing how? You'll see, Talia said cryptically, patting the camera bag that never left her side. Let's just say that if Sabrina wants to make a scene, I'm going to make sure it's documented from every possible angle. At 2:30, the multipurpose room began filling with an audience larger than anyone had anticipated. Word had spread beyond Roosevelt's walls, and Zuri spotted several faces she didn't recognize, including a woman with a press badge who appeared to be taking notes for a larger publication. Elena Vasquez had arrived that morning from New York, a striking woman in her 40s who carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from years of working in an industry where every decision was scrutinized and judged. She had spent an hour with Zuri during lunch, offering encouragement and practical advice about presenting design work to an audience. Remember, Elena had said, you're not just showing them clothes. You're telling them a story about resilience, creativity, and the power of turning negative experiences into something beautiful. That story is what makes your work special. Now as Zuri stood at the front of the room with her 3 pieces displayed on borrowed mannequins, she tried to channel that confidence even as her hands shook slightly with nervous energy. The second skin jacket looked powerful and professional. Under the fluorescent lights, while unseen threads seemed to shimmer and flow even while perfectly still. Armor light dominated the space with its bold emerald color and complex construction, a garment that demanded attention and respect. I'd like to begin by talking about the inspiration behind these pieces. Zuri started, her voice stronger than she had expected it to be. Each one represents a different aspect of what it means to survive difficult circumstances while maintaining your sense of self and your ability to create beauty. She was 3 minutes into her presentation, explaining the construction techniques behind Second Skin when Sabrina made her move. Excuse me, Sabrina said loudly, standing up from her seat near the back of the room. I hate to interrupt, but I think there's something the audience should know about these so-called original designs. The room fell silent, and Zuri felt her heart begin to pound against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was it, the moment Sabrina had been planning, the public destruction that was supposed to bring Zuri's moment of triumph crashing down around her. That jacket, Sabrina continued, pointing at Second Skin with theatrical precision. is clearly copied from a design by Maria Rodriguez that appeared in Fashion Week last year. And the green ensemble is obviously inspired by work from the Detroit Institute of Art's fashion exhibition. Murmurs rippled through the audience, and Zuri felt the room's energy shift as doubt began to creep in. But before she could respond, Elena Vasquez stood up from her seat in the front row, her expression calm but unmistakably authoritative. "That's an interesting accusation," Elena said, her voice carrying easily across the room. "Perhaps you could show us the specific pieces you're referencing." Sabrina's confidence faltered slightly, but she pressed on. "I have them right here," she said, pulling out her phone and beginning to scroll through what appeared to be a collection of fashion photographs. But as she searched, Talia stood up from her position near the side wall, her camera trained not on Zuri's garments but on Sabrina herself. "While we're waiting for that evidence," Talia said clearly, "maybe the audience would be interested in seeing this." She connected her camera to the room's projection system, and suddenly the wall behind Zuri was filled with a crystal-clear video of Sabrina, just 2 days earlier, attempting to cut into one of Zuri's garment bags with a pair of scissors she had clearly brought for the purpose. The footage showed Sabrina looking around carefully to make sure she wasn't being observed, then methodically trying to damage the emerald armor light ensemble in a way that would look like an accident. What she hadn't known was that Talia had been documenting everything for weeks, building a comprehensive record of harassment that she had planned to use if Sabrina's behavior escalated. The room erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs as the truth of Sabrina's desperation became undeniably clear. This wasn't about protecting artistic integrity or exposing plagiarism. This was about a girl so threatened by someone else's talent that she was willing to resort to destruction and false accusations to maintain her sense of superiority. "I think," Principal Harrington said, standing up from his seat with an expression that could have cut steel, "that Ms. Hawthorne and I need to have a conversation, immediately." As Sabrina was escorted from the room, her face flushed with humiliation and her accusations crumbling in the face of video evidence, Zuri felt something shift inside her chest. The fear that had been her constant companion for so long was finally, definitively gone. "Now then," Elena Vasquez said with a smile, settling back into her seat, "shall we continue with the presentation? I believe you were explaining your construction techniques." And for the first time in her life, Zuri Allen stepped fully into her power and began to tell her story without fear, without apology, and without anyone trying to tear her down. 3 weeks later, Zuri Allen stood in the wings of a converted warehouse in Manhattan's garment district, watching models she had only dreamed of working with prepare to wear her designs down a professional runway for the first time in her life. The National Young Designers Showcase was everything Elena Vasquez had promised and more, a glittering convergence of teenage talent, industry professionals, and media attention that felt both surreal and absolutely terrifying. 20 young designers from across the country had been selected to participate, each presenting a 3-piece collection that would be judged by a panel of established designers, fashion educators, and industry insiders. "You nervous?" asked Malik Chun, a 17-year-old from Chicago whose architectural-inspired menswear had immediately caught Zuri's attention when she'd seen it during rehearsals. Over the past 3 days of preparation, he had become her closest ally among the participants, someone who understood the particular pressure of being young, talented, and acutely aware that this opportunity might be the only shot they'd get. Terrified, Zuri admitted, watching as her first model, a statuesque girl named Keiko, who moved like liquid grace, did final adjustments to the second skin jacket. "You?" "Same," Malik said with a grin, "but the good kind of terrified. Like jumping off a cliff when you're pretty sure you can fly." The energy backstage was electric with the kind of creative chaos that Zuri was beginning to understand was standard in the fashion world. Makeup artists moved between models with the efficiency of surgical teams. Stylists made last-minute adjustments to hair and accessories, and designers checked and double-checked every detail of their collections with the obsessive precision of people who knew they would be judged on every stitch and seam dot through the curtain that separated backstage from the audience. Zuri could hear the growing murmur of voices as people took their seats. Alina had told her that the guest list included editors from major fashion magazines, buyers from department stores, and talent scouts from design schools who were always looking for the next generation of creative minds. Zuri Allen called the show coordinator, a harried-looking woman with a headset who had been managing the controlled chaos all afternoon. "You're number 7. Your models know the lineup?" Zuri nodded, though her mouth felt too dry to speak. She had rehearsed the sequence with her 3 models dozens of times. Keiko would lead in Second Skin, followed by Amara in Unseen Threads, and finally Nina in Armor Light. Each piece told part of her story, but together they created a narrative about transformation and strength that she hoped would resonate with people who had never lived her particular experience. "Places," the coordinator called, and suddenly the backstage area fell silent, except for the distant throb of music from the runway. Zuri watched from the wings as the first designer's collection walked sleek, minimalist pieces in black and white that spoke of urban sophistication and architectural precision. The audience responded with polite applause, and she tried to gauge their energy level, to understand what they were looking for and whether her own work would measure up. The second collection was all flowing fabrics and botanical prints, pieces that looked like they had been inspired by secret gardens and fairy tales. The third was sharp-edged athleisure that suggested the designer had spent years observing the intersection of sports and street fashion. Each collection was polished, professional, and undeniably talented, and each one made Zuri more aware of how different her own work was. Rougher around the edges perhaps, but infused with a kind of raw emotional honesty that she was beginning to understand might be her greatest strength. Collection 7, Reclamation Series by Zuri Allen. The announcer's voice carried clearly through the space, and suddenly it was her moment. Keiko stepped onto the runway in Second Skin, and Zuri watched through the gap in the curtains as the audience's energy shifted perceptibly. The jacket commanded attention in a way that was both subtle and undeniable. The charcoal gray wool seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously, and the carefully placed details revealed themselves as Keiko moved, creating new visual interest. With every step, then Amara appeared in Unseen Threads, and Zuri heard an audible intake of breath from the audience. The cream silk dress moved like liquid starlight, and the hand-sewn details caught the runway lights in ways that made the entire garment seem to shimmer and shift. It was elegant and complex at the same time, a piece that rewarded closer inspection, while maintaining its impact from a distance. But it was Nina in Armor Light who brought the house down. The Emerald Ensemble commanded the runway with an authority that seemed to surprise everyone, including Nina herself. The combination of structured elements and flowing fabric created a visual dialogue about strength and vulnerability that was impossible to ignore. And when Nina reached the end of the runway and struck her final pose, the applause was immediate and sustained. As her 3 models walked the runway together for the final pass, Zuri felt something settle into place in her chest, a sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. These weren't just clothes. They were statements, stories, declarations of independence. From a world that had tried to tell her she didn't matter, the response was immediate and overwhelming. As soon as the show ended, Zuri found herself surrounded by people whose names she recognized from fashion magazines and websites, all wanting to know about her inspiration, her techniques, her plans for the future. "The emotional resonance is remarkable," said a woman who introduced herself as a senior editor from a major fashion publication. "You're not just designing clothes, You're creating wearable narratives about resilience and transformation. Where did you learn to work with fabric like that? Asked a man who turned out to be a talent scout from Parsons School of Design. That hand-sewing technique in the cream piece is museum-quality work. But it was the conversation with James Morrison, a designer whose work Zuri had been following online for years, that really stopped her in her tracks. "I've been watching fashion for 30 years, he said, studying her with the kind of intensity that made her feel like he was seeing things she hadn't even realized were there. And I can count on one hand the number of times I've seen work that made me remember why I fell in love with this industry in the first place. Your collection did that." "Thank you," Zuri managed, though the words felt completely inadequate. "I'm serious," James continued. "There's something in your work, an authenticity, a willingness to be vulnerable, that's incredibly rare. The technical skill can be taught, refined, developed, but that emotional honesty, that comes from somewhere else entirely." As the evening wound down and the adrenaline began to fade, Zuri found herself standing on the roof terrace of the venue, looking out over Manhattan's glittering skyline and trying to process everything that had happened. 3 months ago, she had been invisible, just another scholarship student trying to survive high school. Now she was standing in New York City, having just presented her work to some of the most influential people in fashion, and they were talking about her future like it was something worth investing in. Her phone buzzed with a text from Terrence. "Did you knock them dead?" "Because I told everyone at school that my sister was going to be famous, and I have a reputation to maintain." She smiled, typing back, "I think I might have knocked them unconscious. We'll report back with details." As she stood there, overlooking the city that represented everything she had dreamed about, but never dared to hope for, Zuri Allen allowed herself to believe, for the first time in her life, that maybe her story was just beginning. The call came at 7:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 days after Zuri had returned to Detroit with a head full of memories and a suitcase full of business cards from people whose names she had only seen in fashion magazines. "Zuri, this is James Morrison." The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, though hearing it in her cramped bedroom instead of a Manhattan venue made the entire experience feel surreal. "I hope I'm not calling too early, but I wanted to talk to you about something before you made any other commitments." Zuri sat up in bed, instantly alert despite having been deeply asleep moments earlier. "No, it's fine. I mean, this is fine. Good morning." "I've been thinking about our conversation at the showcase," James continued, "and about your work. I'd like to offer you something that I think could change your trajectory significantly." For the next 20 minutes, James outlined an opportunity that was both thrilling and terrifying in equal measure. His design house was launching a new mentorship program for emerging talent, and he wanted Zuri to be the first participant. It would mean working directly with his team, learning advanced design and construction techniques, and having access to resources and materials that she had only dreamed about. The catch, because there was always a catch, was that it would require her to relocate to New York immediately, to finish her education through a specialized program for young professionals while working in his studio. It was a chance to fast-track her career in ways that traditional education couldn't match, but it would mean leaving Detroit, leaving her family, leaving everything familiar behind. "I don't need an answer right now," James said as the conversation wound down, "but I do need one soon. Opportunities like this don't wait around for people to make up their minds." After he hung up, Zuri sat in her bed for a long time, staring at her phone and trying to process what had just happened. This was everything she had ever wanted: a chance to work with one of the designers she most admired, access to resources that could accelerate her learning by years, the possibility of a career that went far beyond anything she had dared to imagine. But it was also terrifying in ways she hadn't anticipated. Moving to New York would mean leaving Terrence during some of the most important years of his life, leaving her mother to handle everything alone, abandoning the community and support system that had helped shape who she was. You look like someone just offered you $1 million and you're not sure you want it, Terrence observed from the doorway, where he had apparently been watching her internal crisis with the kind of patient attention that only little brothers could manage. Something like that, Zuri said, and found herself explaining the entire conversation, laying out the opportunity and the dilemma with the same careful precision she used when planning a garment construction. So basically, Terrence said when she finished, some famous designer wants to make you his apprentice, but it means moving to New York and leaving us behind. That's a pretty accurate summary. Terrence was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a wisdom that seemed too old for his 12-year-old frame. You know what Grandma used to say about opportunities? What? That they don't come to people who are ready for them. They come to people who are brave enough to grab them, even when they're not ready. He paused, studying her face with an intensity that reminded her of their grandmother. Are you brave enough, Zuri? The question haunted her for the rest of the day. At school, she found it difficult to concentrate on anything, her mind constantly cycling through possibilities and potential consequences. During lunch, she confided in Talia, who listened with the kind of focused attention that had made her such a good journalist. You have to take it, Talia said immediately. This is exactly what you've been working toward your entire life. But what about my family? What about Terrence? What about them? Talia asked gently. Terrence is proud of you. Your mother is proud of you. They want you to succeed. Zuri, taking this opportunity isn't abandoning them. It's honoring everything they've done to help you get here. That evening, as Zuri sat at the kitchen table working on a new design, her mother came home from her second job with the kind of exhausted satisfaction that came from a day of honest work completed. James Morrison called me today, Zuri said. Without preamble, her mother stopped in the middle of hanging up her coat, turning to look at her daughter with an expression that was equal parts curious and concerned. The designer from New York, he offered me a mentorship in his studio, but it would mean moving to New York and finishing school there. For a long moment, the apartment was completely silent except for the distant sound of traffic and the hum of the refrigerator. Then her mother sat down across from her, reaching out to cover Zuri's hands with her own. What do you want to do? She asked quietly. I don't know, Zuri admitted. I want to take it, but I'm scared. Of leaving you and Terrence, of failing, of not being good enough for something this big. Baby, her mother said, and her voice carried the kind of gentle strength that had gotten their family through countless difficult times. You have been good enough for something this big since you were 8 years old and started redesigning your school clothes. The only question is whether you're ready to believe it. That night, Zuri called James Morrison back. I want to accept your offer, she said, the words coming out in a rush before she could second-guess herself. But I need to negotiate one thing. What's that? I need to be able to come home regularly. Every few months at least. My family is important to me, and I won't succeed if I feel like I'm abandoning them. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment Zuri was terrified that she had just talked herself out of the opportunity of a lifetime. Done, James said finally. In fact, I think that's exactly the kind of grounded perspective that will make you a better designer in the long run. As Zuri hung up the phone and began to contemplate the magnitude of what she had just committed to, she felt Terrence's presence in the doorway. So, he asked. So I'm moving to New York to become a fashion designer, she said, and the words sounded surreal even as she spoke them. Good, Terrence said with satisfaction. Because I already told everyone at school that my sister was going to be famous, and it would be really embarrassing if I was wrong. Later that night, as Zuri began the process of planning for a future that was both terrifying and exhilarating, She found herself thinking about the girl who had walked into Roosevelt High School just a few months earlier, quiet, scared, trying to make herself invisible. That girl was gone, replaced by someone who understood that visibility wasn't something to fear, but something to claim. That her voice and her vision and her particular way of seeing the world were not weaknesses to be hidden, but strengths to be celebrated. Tomorrow, she would begin the process of preparing for New York, for a new kind of education, for a future that stretched out ahead of her like an unfinished garment waiting to be completed. But tonight, she sat at her grandmother's sewing machine one last time, working on a piece she would never submit to any program or show to any designer. A simple dress made from scraps and remnants. A love letter to the place and the people who had shaped her into someone brave enough to reach for impossible things. Because Zuri Allen had learned something important over the past few months. You could take the girl out of Detroit, but the threads that connected her to home were woven too deeply to ever be completely severed. And sometimes, those threads were exactly what gave you the strength to fly. 6 months later, Zuri Allen stood in what had once been Roosevelt High School's abandoned home economics classroom, watching as 15 students worked with focused intensity at sewing machines that hummed like a chorus of mechanical angels. The room had been transformed from a dusty storage space into something that pulsed with creative energy. Bolts of donated fabric lined the walls in organized rainbow arrays. Design sketches covered every available surface, and the air itself seemed charged with the electricity of dreams being actively pursued. "The seam allowance needs to be consistent," Zuri called out to Maya, a sophomore whose natural talent with color had caught her attention during the co-op's first week. "1/4 inch all the way through, or the whole silhouette will be off." Maya nodded, carefully adjusting her work with the kind of concentration that Zuri recognized in herself, the absolute focus that came when you found something that made sense in a world that often didn't. Around the room, other students were equally absorbed in their projects. Devin working on a structured jacket that would have looked at home in any professional studio. Aaliyah hand-sewing beadwork onto a dress that shimmered like captured starlight. Marcus sketching design modifications with the quick confidence of someone who understood how fabric moved and draped. The Roosevelt High Fashion Collective, the official name that had emerged after weeks of student input and democratic voting, had started as an ambitious dream and evolved into something that surprised even Zuri with its success. What had begun with her proposal to Principal Harrington for a simple after-school sewing circle had grown into a fully funded program that served not just as a creative outlet, but as a pipeline for students who had never imagined they could pursue careers in design, fashion production, or textile arts. "Zuri, can you look at this pattern piece?" called Jordan, a junior whose initial skepticism about fashion had given way to fascination with the mathematical precision required for proper pattern making. "I think I'm missing something in the construction logic." As Zuri moved across the room to help Jordan troubleshoot his pattern, she caught sight of herself in one of the full-length mirrors that lined the far wall mirrors that had been donated by Chloe's mother's boutique, along with a standing commitment to provide fabric remnants and samples whenever the collective needed materials. The girl in the reflection looked confident, purposeful, completely at ease in her role as mentor and leader. It was sometimes difficult to reconcile this version of herself with the scared, invisible student who had once tried to disappear into these same hallways. "The issue is here," she pointed out to Jordan, indicating where his pattern piece didn't account for the proper dart placement. "See how the bust line won't sit correctly if you don't adjust for the natural curve. Fashion is physics as much as it is art." "That makes sense," Jordan said, his face lighting up with understanding. "It's like engineering, but with fabric instead of steel." "Exactly," Zuri said, and felt the familiar warm satisfaction that came from watching someone else discover their own capability. This was perhaps what she loved most about the collective, not just the creating, but the teaching, The moment when students realized they could transform their ideas into tangible, wearable reality. The collective met 4 times a week after school and all day on Saturdays, drawing students from across Roosevelt's social spectrum in ways that would have been impossible before. Zuri's story had reshuffled the school's social dynamics. There were scholarship students like herself who had always sewn by necessity, but also kids from middle-class families who were drawn to the creative challenge, and even a few from wealthier backgrounds who were discovering that making something with your own hands provided a satisfaction that money couldn't buy. "How's it going in here?" asked Mr. Fenwick, appearing in the doorway with his usual air of casual authority. As the collective's official faculty sponsor, he had been instrumental in navigating the bureaucratic requirements and securing the funding that made the program possible. "I brought coffee for the caffeine-dependent members of our creative community." Cheer went up from several of the older students, who had been working on competition pieces for the upcoming Detroit Young Artists Showcase. The collective's reputation had grown quickly beyond Roosevelt's walls, and invitations to participate in citywide and regional events had been arriving with increasing frequency. "Mr. Fenwick," called Aaliyah, looking up from her beadwork, "can you settle an argument? Zuri says that hand sewing is always stronger than machine work for detailed pieces, but Marcus thinks that's just romantic thinking." "Both of you are right," Mr. Fenwick said diplomatically, though he winked at Zuri. "It depends entirely on the application and the skill of the person doing the work. But I will say this, some techniques can't be replicated by machine, no matter how advanced the technology." As the afternoon session wound down and students began cleaning their work areas and carefully storing their projects, Zuri found herself thinking about the transformation that had rippled outward from her individual story to encompass the entire school community. The collective was just one visible manifestation of changes that had touched Roosevelt High in ways both obvious and subtle. Principal Harrington had secured grant funding not just for the fashion program, but for expanded arts offerings across the board, a music production lab, a digital media studio, and a visual arts program that now included opportunities for students to exhibit their work in local galleries. The story of Zuri's transformation had attracted attention from arts advocacy organizations, and Roosevelt High had become something of a model for how creative programming could engage students who might otherwise feel disconnected from traditional academic pathways. "Zuri?" The voice belonged to Chloe, who had become one of the collective's most dedicated members and Zuri's unofficial assistant director. "I wanted to run something by you before everyone leaves." Over the months, Chloe's evolution had been as dramatic as anyone's. Her genuine remorse over her role in the bullying incident had transformed into fierce advocacy for inclusive creative spaces, and her insider knowledge of fashion retail had proved invaluable in helping the collective establish relationships with local businesses and suppliers. "What's up?" Zuri asked, finishing her notes about the day's progress in the logbook she kept to track each student's development. "I've been talking to my mom about the spring fashion show," Chloe said, referring to the collective's ambitious plan to stage a professional quality runway presentation featuring work from all the participating students. "She wants to sponsor it officially through the boutique, and she's offered to let us use the event space at the Detroit Institute of Arts." Zuri felt her breath catch. The DIA was one of the city's most prestigious cultural venues, a place where major exhibitions drew visitors from around the world. The idea of Roosevelt High students showing their work in such a setting felt both thrilling and slightly surreal. "Are you serious?" she asked. "Completely serious," Chloe said, her excitement barely contained. "She says that what we're doing here, giving kids opportunities to develop real skills and artistic vision, is exactly the kind of program that deserves institutional support." As they talked through the logistics and possibilities, other students began to gather around them, their own excitement building as they realized the scale of what was being offered. This wouldn't just be a school fashion show in a gymnasium. It would be a genuine professional presentation that could attract media attention, college recruiters, and industry professionals. We should document the whole process, suggested Devin, who had developed an interest in fashion photography alongside his design work. From concept to runway. Show people how much work and creativity goes into something like this. Actually, said a familiar voice from the doorway, I've already been doing that. Everyone turned to see Talia entering the room with her camera. Equipment, as she had been doing regularly for months. What had started as documentation for her blog had evolved into something much more ambitious, a full-length documentary about Zuri's journey and the collective's founding that she was producing for her senior capstone project. I've been following this story since the beginning, Talia continued, setting up her camera to capture the planning session that was spontaneously developing. And I think the spring show could be the perfect culmination for the film. The full circle from one girl getting bullied for her handmade clothes to a whole community of students celebrating creative expression. As the conversation continued, with students throwing out ideas for themes and concepts for the spring show, Zuri felt a deep sense of satisfaction settling in her chest. This was what success actually looked like, not just individual achievement, but the creation of opportunities for others to discover their own potential. She glanced toward the back corner of the room, where a familiar figure had been quietly observing the proceedings. Sabrina Hawthorne sat alone at one of the smaller work tables, not actively participating, but not leaving either. Her presence at collective meetings had started about 2 months earlier, tentative at first, then becoming regular if still somewhat distant. The girl who had once ruled Roosevelt High through fear and exclusion was now just another student. Her power base eroded, and her former followers having moved on to other interests and allegiances. But rather than disappearing entirely, she had begun showing up to collective meetings, watching the work with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. Zuri had never directly invited her to participate, but she had never asked her to leave either. There was something about Sabrina's quiet observation that suggested someone genuinely trying to understand what she had attempted to destroy. And Zuri found that her anger had transformed over time into something closer to pity mixed with cautious hope. Sabrina, Zuri said, making a decision that surprised even herself. Did you want to contribute any ideas for the spring show? The room fell silent, and Zuri could feel the tension that always accompanied any direct interaction between her and her former tormentor. But when Sabrina looked up, there was no trace of the calculated cruelty that had once defined her interactions. I don't know anything about fashion, Sabrina said quietly. But I've been watching what you've all been doing, and I think it's remarkable. The way you've created something positive from ... double quotes, she paused, clearly struggling with the words. From something that started with me trying to tear you down. It wasn't quite an apology. Sabrina had never been capable of that kind of direct vulnerability, but it was perhaps as close as she could come to acknowledging the harm she had caused and the growth she was witnessing. Fashion isn't just about knowing techniques, Zuri said carefully. It's about understanding stories, about helping people express who they are or who they want to become. Everyone has something to contribute to that conversation. The moment stretched between them, heavy with the weight of their shared history and the possibility of something different moving forward. Finally, Sabrina nodded once and returned to her quiet observation. But something in the quality of her attention had shifted from mere watching to something that looked more like genuine engagement. As the planning session began to wind down, and students started gathering their belongings to head home, Zuri found herself staying behind to tidy the workspace and check that all the expensive equipment was properly secured. The collective had grown far beyond what she had imagined possible, but with that growth came responsibility that she took seriously. You know, Mr. Fenwick said, appearing beside her as she organized fabric scraps that could be used for future projects. I've been teaching for 15 years, and I've never seen a student program create the kind of ripple effects that this collective has generated." "What do you mean?" Zuri asked, though she suspected she knew what he was referring to. "Applications to Roosevelt High have increased by 30% this year," he said with a slight smile. "Families are specifically asking about our arts. Programming. Students who might have gone to private schools are choosing to stay because of opportunities like this. You've helped change the entire trajectory of this institution." The weight of that statement settled over Zuri like a well-fitted garment, significant but comfortable, substantial but not overwhelming. She had started this journey simply trying to survive high school without being destroyed by the cruelty of others. The idea that her response to that cruelty had created something that was actively helping other students felt almost too large to fully comprehend. "It's not just me," she said, gesturing toward the evidence of the afternoon's work that surrounded them. "Look at what everyone has accomplished. I just provided a framework." "Leadership isn't about doing everything yourself," Mr. Fenwick pointed out. "It's about creating conditions where other people can discover what they're capable of. And that's exactly what you've done." Later that evening, as Zuri sat in her bedroom working on designs for her own contribution to the spring show, she found herself reflecting on the strange mathematics of transformation. 6 months ago, the destruction of her grandmother's coat had felt like the end of something precious and irreplaceable. Now that same destruction had become the catalyst for a creative community that was touching dozens of lives and reshaping an entire institution. Her phone buzzed with a text from Terrence, who was spending the weekend with friends but never missed an opportunity to check in on his sister's various projects. "Mom showed me the pictures from today's collective meeting. Looks like you're officially running a small fashion empire now. Very impressive, CEO Allen." She smiled, typing back, "Empire is a strong word, more like a creative democracy." "Even better," came his immediate response. "Empires fall. Democracies adapt and grow." As Zuri returned to her sketching, she found herself designing something she hadn't planned, a piece that would tell the story of the collective itself, incorporating elements from each of the students who had contributed to its success. Fabric pieces that Devin had helped her understand, beadwork techniques that Aliyah had shared, construction methods that Jordan had refined through his engineering perspective. It would be a collaborative garment in the truest sense, a physical manifestation of the creative community that had grown from the ashes of her personal destruction. And as she worked, she began to understand that this was what legacy actually looked like, not individual achievements that stood alone, but the creation of systems and opportunities that would continue long after she had moved on to other challenges. 3 hours later, as she put down her pencil and prepared for sleep, Zuri opened a new sketchbook, a gift from James Morrison, who had insisted that every serious designer needed pristine paper for their most important ideas. On the first page, she wrote 3 lines that seemed to capture everything she had learned about the relationship between destruction and creation, between individual talent and community support, between surviving cruelty and transforming it into something beautiful, made from scraps, worn like armor, told through thread. Below those words, she began sketching the first design for what would become the Roosevelt High Fashion Collective's signature piece, a garment that told the story of students who had learned to transform whatever materials they had been given into expressions of strength, creativity, and hope. Outside her window, Detroit stretched out in all directions, a city that knew something about reinvention, about taking what others had discarded and making it into something new and valuable. And in her small room, surrounded by the tools and materials of her craft, Zuri Allen continued the work of transformation, one stitch, one student, one story at a time. The quiet revolution had become a permanent change, and it was more beautiful than she had ever dared to imagine. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.